Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 78. My guest in this episode is Dr. Michael Levin. Dr. Levin is a developmental and synthetic biologist at Tufts University, where he is the Vannevar Bush Distinguished Professor. And Dr. Levin is also the director of the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University and Tufts Center for Regenerative and Developmental Biology. And in this conversation, I tried to have a different discussion with Dr. Levin and move us out into some discussion space that hasn't been covered in some of his presentations or other interviews. So I hope this is a benefit to those who follow his work. I tried to ask some novel questions. So thank you so much for joining us as an observer of this conversation. And thank you to those of you who are subscribed to the channel. Enjoy the conversation. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Levin to the IdeaCast interview series. I've been really looking forward to this interview. We booked about a month or so ago, and I've been doing my homework and studying. Michael, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here as a guest.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Good. Because as I said before we hit record, it's going to be different, and I'll say that to you guys in the YouTube audience. On that matter, I would like to do some shop cleaning here before we get started, or some business to take care of. If you're not familiar with Dr. Levin's work, I would suggest I will have his channel down below in the description field. Go and watch a couple of his presentations that he does. Become familiar with some of the groundwork that he does, some of the ideas that he presents. Because this conversation is going to be more geared towards people who are familiar with his work, who have watched some of the interviews that he's done, and there are countless interviews out there that are all incredible. And so we're going to pick up from some of the work that's already out there and go in a different direction. So again, if you're not familiar with the work, I would suggest you do that. And please subscribe to his channel while you're there. He's picked up probably 300 subscribers since the beginning of the year, and I want to see that momentum build. So anyway, Dr. Levin, let's see. I would like to, and then one other thing for the audience. A lot of you guys are full of mind people, and we're not going to address consciousness necessarily, and it might insert itself in here a little bit. So phenomenal consciousness, first person, qualia, things like that, maybe not so much. We're going to be talking about intelligence, and Dr. Levin, you like to use the Jamesian version of that, which is problem solving over multiple or variable domains or areas to achieve a problem. So does that do it justice when we talk about it that way?
Yeah, we can get into the details, but that's roughly it.
All right, so I just wanted to put that disclaimer out for the audience too, that we're going to be tackling intelligence. So on that matter, Dr. Levin, I would like to go ahead and start right at the beginning as far as it concerns any of us living creatures on this planet. And in lensing abiogenesis and autopoiesis through your work, through what you've done, it becomes a little, to me, more feasible to not be so surprised that life emerged on this planet, that abiogenesis occurred. Would you be comfortable talking to that? And so I'll preface that by saying in another interview, you said, it's intelligence all the way down, if that's a fair way to say it, that we shouldn't assume in a sort of a classic linear fashion, a reductive physics fashion, that that life can potentially emerge from a soup of lipids or strange amino acids or whatever's pooling in warm water 4 billion years ago. So the archaea showed up like 4.1 billion years ago. So could you speak to that and lens it through the work that you do?
Sure. Well, a couple of key things to start off with is the definitions of life and definitions of intelligence. So I do believe that intelligence is predates life, and intelligence is a bigger sort of in this Venn diagram of things. Intelligence is bigger than life. But in order to talk about that, let me say a couple of things about these definitions. First of all, I really dislike any kind of sharp binary definitions in this field, and so I spend no time trying to figure out whether something is or isn't life or cognition or intelligence. I think that just leaves you with a bunch of unsolvable pseudo problems. I think that what we end up calling life are the things that manage to scale up their intelligence from the competencies of very primitive, and we'll talk in a minute about how far down it goes, but things that scale up the extremely primitive basement level sort of proto intelligent capacities of a simple matter, when that gets scaled up in an interesting way, we end up calling that life. And so I do think that all of this was the simple things that we can even talk about in particles and so on were here before the things that we now recognize as life.
And I mentioned to you before we hit record that I was listening to a dialogue between you and Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and towards the end of that conversation in the last 10 minutes, I think it was summed up beautifully between both of you that, and I am going to bring the C word in for this, but that mind or intelligence or whatever we want to call it is phasal. And I love that. That's how I tend to look at it. I may be a monist, if you put a gun to my head at some point, but the phases, so that I think lends itself to what you just said in terms of, where's the line between life and non-life, that these are just sort of phases of something that may be ineffable or inaccessible or insoluble or whatever. So does that map onto what you just said, do you think?
Yeah, that's reasonable. I think that the one thing that I want to emphasize, and this kind of continuity view is critiqued a lot by the following sort of idea that well, why would you want to we have these nice this nice terminology, intelligence, cognition, and so on. Why would you want to paint that onto rocks and particles and things like this, right? This is just profligate, right? It loses all meaning. That would be the kind of the Steelman argument of this, is you would say that, well, you wouldn't want to do that. Keep the words pure for examples that we're sure of, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my view on this is as follows. I think that word games and precise linguistic definitions are useless. I'm not interested in any of that. What I am interested in is a kind of engineering kind of observer-based view, where what's useful about this terminology is, do they help you recognize, relate to, predict, modify, and build novel systems. So the question of why you would apply one of these terms, for example, intelligence, problem solving, these kinds of things, to an unconventional type of system, let's say some kind of molecular, some simple molecular scenario. The only reason you would apply that is if it gives you some sort of advantage in relating to that system in a practical way. So to me, all of these things are not, I don't believe you can have philosophical feelings about these things. You can't decide it from an armchair looking at something, whether that's just chemistry or physics. That's not real cognition. I don't think you can do any of that from a philosophical position. I think you have to do experiments. And so for me, when I say such and such is on the spectrum of cognition, what I'm saying is that I can make a specific claim, that's an empirical claim, that in a specific context, this thing is able to put forth some level of competency in achieving some type of goal. And by saying that, I am facilitating the engineering enterprise. In other words, this is not mere philosophy. These are not just words. This is an empirical claim that might be true or false. And so after I've said this, somebody else can say, wow, he's saying that you can take certain concepts from behavioral science, from cybernetics, from wherever, apply it to the system. Well, why don't we try and let's find out? And if we get somewhere, then that supports that view. And if we don't, then he's wrong. And so that's, in extending these words beyond their normal meaning, what I'm leaning on is the idea that I expect a utility, a practical utility from doing so. And if there is no practical utility, then it's wrong. That's my final criterion for all of these kinds of things, is does it help you get to new capabilities, new understanding, new experiments?
I pulled a statement out of one of your publications in the literature, and I think it fits well with what you just said, and it's defining an individual as an information processing structure. I mean, that lending that breadth to what you're trying to point to here. So we're not confining ourselves too much to rigid or even binary kind of. Is that lending itself to what you just said?
I think an individual is more than that.
Okay.
And we can, that it's a separate question if you want to talk about how far down I think the continuum goes. So we can talk about the absolute minimal versions of these. But in the broader sense, I take I tend to use the word self with a capital S, some kind of self, which is an agent. And I think that has more to it than just information processing. It presupposes something I call a cognitive light cone, which is this spatiotemporal size of the biggest goals you can actually work towards. And so it has a proper self has an autopoietic history of putting itself together from pieces. It has a multi-scale structure. It has some degree of a cognitive light cone. It has some level of competency in achieving the goals in whatever space it happens to be working in. Part of that is no doubt processing information, but I think these other components are pretty key to that.
Okay, and I actually have that figure here I can share briefly with the audience too, because I think cognitive light cone is an important part of the work you do, and I had this on reserve just in case the opportunity came up to show it. So if the audience can see that. We're seeing cognitive light cones. Can you speak to that for a moment, and then we'll move on to another question.
Sure. So this came out of a conference, I think in 2018, I believe, where Pranab Das asked us to. There were a bunch of us there, and he asked us to think about frameworks in which you can simultaneously compare and comprise diverse intelligences. And so people often think of diverse intelligences as, well, you've got some primates and maybe crows and some dolphins and maybe an octopus and some things like that. I wanted to take it to the limit, and so I wanted a framework that can subsume bioengineered novel creatures, possible aliens, software AI, minimal active agents, active matter, like all of it. And so in thinking about what do all of those things have in common, that is, how can we think about all of those different things within one framework? Well, here are the things you can't use. So you can't use a genetics tree of life approach, because most of those things are not going to be on our tree of life. You can't rely on specific size and time scales, because we need to be able to consider radically different creatures that live on at extremely fast time scales, or maybe some sort of, at one point I was thinking about solar system level synapses that can be made into these gigantic gravitational, kind of nervous systems, so to speak. So you can't trust any of that. You can't rely on what they're made of. You can't rely on how they got here, meaning evolved versus engineered. So what do they have in common? And what struck me that they have in common, and of course, William James, as with most things, got there first. But I tried to quantify it a little bit. Is this idea of goal directedness? And so what anything that we want to call an agent of some sort, what it's going to have is some capacity to pursue goals in some kind of problem space. So I decided to formalize this notion in this kind of weird, almost like a Minkowski diagram, where the 3 dimensions of space are flattened onto one horizontal axis, time is on the vertical axis. And what I'm plotting here are these cognitive light cones, which are defined as follows. The cognitive light cone, and by the way, this is just step 1 of this kind of framework. There's much more after this, and all of it is really very much under development. So these are all early sort of groping around for the right concepts, but I think it's useful. Okay. So the cognitive light cone is the spatiotemporal size of the biggest goal that a being is capable of pursuing. Not how far its senses and effectors reach, but the biggest goal that it is actively capable of pursuing. So for example, if you're talking about a bacterium or a tick or something like this, all they really care about and try to optimize is the local concentration of some particular attractant molecules, and that's it. They may have a little bit of memory going backwards, a little bit of predictive power going forwards, but basically it's a very local sphere of concern that they have. And it's sort of the thing where if you tell me what are the things you're concerned about and what are the things that you try to manage, I can immediately guess at your cognitive sophistication. So there's your sort of tick or bacterium. Now if you've got a dog, more memory going backwards, more predictive capacity going forwards, bigger radius, so they understand what it is to guard a perimeter of a house and things like this. But a dog is, as far as we know, is never going to care what happens 3 weeks from now, a couple towns over. They just can't. It's just too far away, both in space and time. And then you could have a human, and some humans are working towards world peace over the next couple hundred years, and some humans are actively worried that the sun is going to burn out at some point, and they'd like to do something about that. So humans have potentially a very large cognitive light cone, and every kind of potential being, no matter what you're made of or how you got here, you have some kind of cognitive light cone within which you're able to work. And from here come lots of interesting offshoots. For example, one is that we, like all intelligences, are, especially biological ones, are compound or collective intelligences. So there are light cones within light cones in our body. Right? Our cells and tissues are working on very particular goals that are different from the goals that the whole organism is working on. And the same thing with the molecules inside of them. And also the idea that one could take on a sort of meta goal, and this is another paper that I wrote with some colleagues who are Buddhist scholars. You can take on the meta goal of actually enlarging your cognitive light cone. So you might decide that because with our limited cognitive light cone, we are unable to to exert compassion in the linear range about a sufficient number of other beings. You might undertake a commitment to enlarge your cognitive light cone to the point where you will be capable of exerting active care and compassion towards a significantly larger, amount of other sentient beings. Just for an example. So those are the kind of things that this framework is supposed to allow you to do, is compare beings in radically different embodiments.
Okay, I appreciate that. Now I'm going to drop the share and we'll move on, and I'll get back to some of my strange questions that I have for you. Now, moving along, I guess in a timeline, I noticed in research, preparing to have you as a guest, that nature has, so you speak in terms of swarm intelligence sometimes. So these flesh sacks that we are these unions of cells. They're organized, coordinating, and working in synchrony with each other to reach states and goals and things like that. And so in thinking about how we typically want to have three kingdoms, and we have phylogenetic trees and things like that, but there are these bizarre anomalies that kind of speak to this kind of organization. And this may be trivial, but it's fascinating to me. So you get things like photosynthetic sea slugs and cyanobacteria, lichen, just kind of fringy things like that. And to me, it speaks to that kind of shared space and common goals and interests among seemingly disparate things. And we can unpack our, sort of mammals level uniqueness in that sense. But did you want to speak to any of that, where nature seems to be showing us in her own way things that your team and projects for the future kind of, to me, are mirroring that in a sense? Again, these combined things where you have animals like slugs that are using photosynthesis as a means of deriving energy and things like that. This could be trivial, it could be nonsense. You can choose not to bring that. I've got more questions, but if you want to cover that for a minute, I thought that might be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that simultaneously, those kind of examples, of course, are biologically very, very interesting. But in an important sense, they're both more unusual than you need to highlight the collective issue that I'm talking about, and also not weird enough, right? On the one hand, if you think about anything on our tree of life here on Earth, this sort of n of one kind of run through of evolution, I mean, I am pretty sure that this is just a tiny speck in the space of possible, just really bizarre embodiments, right? So things that we could build but with bioengineering, things that are created with software, things that exist on other planets, which I kind of tend to think that there's a lot of life out there. There's going to be much more bizarre kinds of things out there. At the same time, the issue of this kind of many to one collective mystery of mind is already seen. Just imagine, okay, let's just take a perfectly normal human embryo. So no, nothing's more unusual than that. Just imagine at one particular stage, and this is many other embryos are the same way. You've got this flat blastodisc that has tens of thousands of cells in it. Okay, and we look at that and we say that's one embryo, one human embryo. Now, what are we counting when we say one embryo? Because there's tens of thousands of cells there. What are we counting? What we're really counting is alignment. We're counting the fact that all of these cells are going to work together towards a specific goal. There's one goal that belongs to no individual cell, but it belongs to all of them together, which is to build a particular morphological structure, specifically to navigate in the space of possible anatomical goals from the location of where you're a single egg down to where you're a human or whatever you're going to be. And of course it's got some intelligence to this navigation, because if we cut you in half as an early embryo, you don't become two half bodies, you become perfectly normal monozygotic twins. So okay, so let's imagine, so that's what we're counting. Now the interesting thing is that what you could do, and I've done this myself with duck embryos as a grad student, you can take a little needle and you can make some scratches in that blastoderm. What happens when you make those scratches is that every part of, so you're sort of partitioning it into little sectors, right? And when you do that, each one of those doesn't feel the others, and so it self-organizes into an entire into an entire embryo, and then they heal up, and so now you've got these conjoined twins and triplets and so on. So now this is a very interesting thing, because when you look at that early embryo, you don't know how many individuals are in there. It could be 0, 1, 2, 3, probably up to half a dozen or so that could be in there. And that is something that isn't determined by genetics. It isn't known ahead of time until the process happens. That is literally a process of autopoiesis, when one bunch of cells decide, what collective do I belong to? And by the way, when they do merge, there's all kinds of interesting issues of cells in between, because they're not sure which one they belong to. And that leads to some other interesting issues with left-right asymmetry that we can talk about. But even right there, you already see we are a collective, and we developed from an embryo, but actually some number of us could come from the same, from that same collective. So it's really this like amazing excitable medium out of which some number of individuals are going to arise, but they're all made of these cells. So already right there, you see that this many to one thing is right there at the beginning of each of our journeys from so-called just physics to being a human.
In thinking about this, would it be theoretically possible for the, not just twins, but if there are 10,000 cells there, I mean, you could have this kind of replication thing to have 30 or 40 identical agent or persons coming out? I mean,
I don't know.
It's not off the table.
Sure. No, I don't know what the I don't know what the limit is. I mean, armadillos have quadruplets every time, so they always the early embryo just divides into quarters.
Okay.
We've humans. I'm pretty sure in like with livestock and things like that, they can take apart embryos at the 8-cell stage and get 8 prize bulls. Or something
okay.
Like this.
Okay.
Almost
a clonal process. It's almost sounds like a clonal process. Okay.
Yeah.
There's, as an aside, it's interesting. Last year, not this past winter, but the winter before, I mentioned to you when we had our pre-meet that I love horticulture and botany. And so one of the things I go after are rare cultivars of coconut. Well, I had a coconut that's tropical for tropical, and it got stressed in the cold. And as a seedling with only like 3 strap leaves on it, it was forced into flower because of the stress induced by the cold. When that brief gnarled up little flowering process occurred, and it never really put out anything other than just some pre-flowers, it then proceeded to pull out multiple heads. So I'm thinking of your work and how this coconut now has 6 heads on it as a seedling. It's really kind of a freak of nature. But I wouldn't say that's maybe genetics. I think that's more, as you say, the morphospace. And it's not quite what you just described, but it's similar. I think that the stress has caused it to make 5-6 heads.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole role of genetics is interesting. I mean, what is genetics, right? We know we can read genomes now, and we know that genes don't code for complex characters. They code for proteins. They code for for the cellular hardware that every cell gets to have. So everything that happens after you've put in that hardware and the system starts to run, everything else is physiology. Everything else is the workings of the laws of computation, of physics, of some other stuff, working through this machine that's specified by the genome. So from that perspective, the hardware software distinction is actually pretty useful.
Okay. Okay. Speaking of DNA and hardware, did you happen to catch that? I sent it to you this morning. It was a little late. It was a Leland Hutner talk. He's from the Max Planck Institute, and it's on anthropogeny at the University of California. You probably didn't catch it.
Not for this morning, no.
Okay. I just flung it at you at the last second. It's a very interesting lecture. And what he's doing in that lecture, and this was a question I was going to bring up if you had the opportunity to study what he was doing. I can't do any justice to it, but I'll try to coarse grain it a little bit here. And that is that the arrival in our line, our hominid line of forebrains and a larger cortical structure, 1.4 to 1.8 liters. I think Neanderthals were 1.8 liters, but we're around that range of 1.4. Anyway, that expansion was caused by a single gene mutation event at 5 million years ago, and prior to us splitting off with Denisovians and other things like that. And what they were saying is that mutation was locked in by, it was an RGAP11A, it converted to RGAP11B, but there were a string of nucleotides that did not, that only would later, like maybe a couple 100,000 or more years would switch. And it was like just one or two little nucleotides that flipped, and they had letters for them. And I have no idea what they were doing there. But anyway, what I wanted to ask you, and you can certainly watch that if you ever find the video, I think it's fascinating, is relating, so where's the complementarity with your work with the genes and say the increase in the cortical capacity and this RGAP11A to B conversion, and then the stall of, I think it was even longer than a couple 100,000 years. It may have been like after we were split from our hominid closest cladeship of other ancestors. And so it fascinates me that this thing was in suspension for so long, and then it triggered, I don't know what triggered it. And again, it was a 55 nucleotide chain that flipped, and there was just a C and an F that flipped. And that's what triggered it on the C end of a branch of whatever. So I'm rambling, but just the idea that something so minute that isn't like brute per force kind of genetics, I wonder if that doesn't relate back to some of the ideas that you're putting forward that would cause our brains to then, over a course of however many more centuries or whatever, that the brain starts to then enlarge. So I don't know if you even want to deal with that. Maybe if I can bring you back as a guest some other time, you can watch that video, get informed on it, because I'm not doing it much justice. But just it fascinates the hell out of me that something so insignificant could cause us to be sitting here talking to silicon plastic boxes and having these really kind of interesting conversations. If you want to deal with it, you can. If not, we'll move on. But that's something that's just always, I saw that lecture a few years ago and it's always stuck with me. So I don't know if you want to deal with that or we can move on.
I haven't seen it yet. So the only thing I'll say now is that many, if not most, genes affect many, if not most, aspects of the body, right? So so there's going to be what else this thing does, where else in the body is also probably a very interesting question,
right?
And you can certainly imagine, right? So let's just again simple-mindedly, let's take a familiar hardware software implementation, which is the modern computer. You can imagine that if you had a suboptimal type of conductor in there, you had a certain level of performance, and then suddenly some molecular switch turned everything to beautiful copper. And suddenly, right, you can imagine having this high performance scenario. So it certainly is true that there are aspects of the hardware that with a small flip can give you big changes in overall performance.
Okay.
So that's about all I can say. But if you want to talk about generally evolution and what I think makes evolution go and things like that, we can do that.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, through your lens, through morphospace and things like that, talk about, and I love the fact, because you shook me out of a kind of slumber where I kind of anthropocentrically think that you and I and all the other 8 billion humans are these sort of, I mean, we are higher order metacognitive, we are higher order self-reflective, but in some of your talks and interviews, you say, hey, no, I can give you demonstrations of very small, simplistic systems that, can have some order of reflection, some order of, and when you're talking about the cognitive light cone, the cone goes up and down. So yeah, let's talk about that and where we are with regard to that. And perhaps even like with your work, where does it go from here in terms of that?
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not going to argue against the idea that humans have a very special cognitive capacity. So I think there are some things that we do extremely well. I think we have to be careful in that we are very bad at recognizing other members of this continuum that we're on. Okay. So we are primed to recognize intelligence of medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds through familiar three-dimensional space. So we see crows and other animals, and we can distinguish them from rocks and so on. So we're good at that. But we have this very strong anthropomorphic lens where we find it very difficult to recognize intelligence in other spaces. So I've made the claim, for example, that I think that if we were born with a primary ability to feel our blood chemistry, then we would have no trouble recognizing our liver and our kidneys as being intelligences that navigate physiological space. So all of these spaces, we are surrounded by other interesting spaces besides 3D space. There are metabolic spaces, physiological state spaces, transcriptional or gene expression spaces, anatomical morphospace, which is what we study in my group most of all, three-dimensional spaces, and then of course linguistic spaces and maybe some other stuff. So we're good at a little bit of that. We're really bad at most of it, and so we have a very hard time detecting problem solving in bacteria, in plants. People are still somehow worked up about plants having some sort of memory and intelligence, and these kinds of things. We're just not very good at it, and so that's, I think, the project of this diverse intelligence emerging field is to become better at it, because we are going to be surrounded going forward by all sorts of things. I have this diagram in one of the that was made by Jeremy Gay, who's an amazing illustrator, that has this like space of possible bodies and minds, and we're talking cyborgs and hybrids and just all these never mind the actual exobiological aliens, but just all the different ways of being an embodied mind in the world. And we really have to get better at recognizing them and developing a set of ethics to relate to them. So humans are certainly interesting in many ways, but one of those is that we're really very fixated on our own way of being.
And that, I think, to get ourselves off the hook, maybe we're fixated or we're working with an artifact of 300 years of empiricism and positivism and things like that. Not to besmirch it, but I think we can see that where that's coming from, and say from the Enlightenment project all the way again through strong empiricism and logical positivism and scientism, if you will. I know that's a pejorative claim, but I mean, we're just sort of locked into this dogma. And a few minutes on Twitter with certain people, and I won't mention their names, but you can start to see the arguments.
But but the good news, at least I think it's good news, is that science naturally leads out of that. There's kind of this like U-shaped curve where we've been sort of at the bottom of that curve in our insistence on explanations at the chemistry or physics level, at trying to this kind of teleophobia where we were terrified of non-human systems with goals and things like this. But I think science naturally climbs out of there. I don't think we need. I absolutely don't think we abandon science. I don't think we abandon the rules of evidence. I think quite the contrary. Good science leads you out of it, because what science does, and we're seeing this now, is construct what in effect are so with modern bioengineering, artificial life, computational science, and so on, we are constructing a bunch of novel systems that in effect, and so these include things like xenobots and other biorobotics and so on. One way to understand all these constructs is as a kind of apparatus. It's a kind of periscope that enables you to peek into a new space. So if all you have is the standard view, and you look at a frog genome, the only thing you're ever going to see is a frog. But once you have this idea that actually this collective intelligence is able to solve various problems, and you start perturbing it, so you don't know, you can't estimate intelligence from observations. You have to do perturbative experiments. And once you start putting things in its path, you see how clever it actually is to get around. And this is all, these are all quantitative, normal sort of science experiments. And in effect, what you're now exploring is the latent space around the frog. You're finding out what else this hardware is capable of.
Okay.
And you would completely not be able to see that using the standard, using the standard kind of approach. And so I think science is going to pull itself out of it, because we are creating these tools that show us the space of the possible. Kaufman calls it the adjacent possible. We can also see the very non-adjacent possible, because you can see some things that are not really very adjacent to what you had before. They're just completely different. But that's fine. So I think we needed that project of pointing out that it isn't enough to say that every rock, stream, and tree has some sort of a spirit on it. That's not enough. You need to understand what the matter is capable of, but then you go build it back up to understand what are actually the agential properties of those materials and of living materials. And you can even, and now we see that you can keep going and use AI to provide a kind of interface to some of this intelligence that was there. That's very hard for us to see. So, it's all right. We're climbing out.
Yeah. And the work that you're doing in your lab and your team, and Josh Bongard and Chris Field, some of your collaborators, Carl Friston, people like that, I think are definitely shining some light into some new terrain and opening up ideas. And maybe in the second half of our conversation, I'd like to talk to you about bioethics and things like that, and how we expand that lens of perception if you're interested in going there. One thing I'd like to do now, and this could be a huge rabbit hole that you may not want to deal with, is so when we're up here as humans in sort of, I hate to use a hierarchy, but we are probably the most self-reflective, metaconscious, or cognitive, or however you want to say that. Would you say that's acceptive in a sense, if we follow that sort of linearity of adaptation? And maybe that's not the best way to look at this, but I'm going to use that as a means to get somewhere. And of course, there's an ambulance going by. Sorry, everyone. If we look at our complexity of our mind and our psychological cache that we have here as these creatures that can plan and predict and model and look back and regret and pine for days that were better, all that kind of stuff. Do you think our psychology is part of this natural, as you say, sort of scale invariant intelligence, and this is just another level, and maybe we're getting used to that as bio creatures? Where does psychology fit in? Where does all the nuance of that, the good and the bad about us, pathology, as well as some of the heights of our artistic achievement and things like that? Yeah. How does that show up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are certainly some new mental states that were unlocked by our particular form and function that maybe are unique, maybe are not. It's not obvious, but probably we have some quite unique ones. And I think that one can, the thing to do is to sort of think about what I think is important to do is to think about here's where we are, and here's how we are sort of brought into the world by the vagaries of evolution and our genetics and the various limitations. And then what's really critical is to look forward and to ask, but what's possible, right? I think to me, what's really important is that there are a lot of people still that have this feeling that, well, the state that we're in right now is in some way good, proper, natural, that's where we belong. And, the sciences shouldn't screw it up and make things worse. And I'm not saying that it's not possible to make things worse. It absolutely is. But I think it's to my framework, it's fundamental to realize that the way we are now with our limitations, with our physical limitations, the various diseases to which we're prone, the weird disorders that we fall prey to, the size of our cognitive light cone, our IQ, and all of that, there is nothing special about any of that. It's where evolution happened to have left us at the moment, but it wasn't optimizing for happiness, for intelligence, for any of our values. It wasn't. It doesn't optimize for any of that, as far as I know. And so all of this is completely up for improvement. In fact, I think we have a moral imperative to improve it. And whatever state we find ourselves in now, the real question is, what can we do to make things better for everyone, for every, to improve the lived experience of every sentient being that we can. I think that's really important. And there are a lot of people that contact me with and they're very fundamentally interested in the question of what are we, right? So what really are we? Where do we come from? How do we get here? All this. And if you probe down to why is that question interesting? What a lot of people will say is, well, because if we're not just the sort of genetic / physics driven automata that we heard in science, if we're not just the products of dog eat dog evolution, then that magic, then I can do X, Y, and Z, right? And I always say, go do that now. Go do it right now. You don't need permission. Whatever it is that we are, that's not the important thing. The important thing is, what do you do next? And so, right. And so you don't, I feel like a lot of people really want permission from science to have to have mental states with meaning, to pursue their dreams, to do amazing things. Yeah, don't wait for that. I mean, we'll work it out. That permission's coming. I'm quite certain of it. But don't wait for that. You don't need it. It's one of my sort of go-to examples of this is there's this, and this is an old science fiction trope, but there's a good example of it in a more recent movie, which was Ex Machina, right? And there's a scene there where the guy is his mind is just sort of all destabilized by interacting with this AI. And he's there in front of a mirror. He starts cutting his arm to see what's inside, because he starts to think that maybe I'm an AI too, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is very natural for a lot of people, but to me, and I came across this in sci-fi, probably 30 years ago in older stories. To me, I think it's exactly backwards. I think Descartes, this is one of those things Descartes got right, which is if you open yourself up and you see a bunch of cogs and gears and wheels and things, your conclusion should not be, oh man, I guess I'm not real, and my, and my mind doesn't exist. And no, your conclusion should be, wow, I guess cogs and gears can have this incredible sense of willpower and magic that I am. And off you go. Like, that's it. You wouldn't have learned anything about yourself. You would have learned something about the cogs and gears, right? Yeah. And people have this real commitment to what they think mere matter is. And I think Ian McGilchrist said this very well. People underestimate what mere matter is capable of, and they think that having a material explanation sort of undoes the magic of their selfhood. And I think they're I think this is mistaken. I think I think waiting for permission from science to sort of nail it all down before you go and act on your potentialities is also a mistake.
I agree. And I think so you've had some conversations with John Vervaeke, and one of them in, I think, part one, forgive me, the host of that show. But anyway, you were on two episodes with John, and he weaves Neoplatonism into his Creole of his ecology of practices, as he likes to say it. And so we have our ancestors standing behind us. And so we can almost do an abstraction here and say, without any kind of, invoking magic or anything like that, but that the work that's been done, if we were to draw on Plato for just a minute for the true, the good, and the beauty, these kind of ideas that can steer us as heuristics and lodestars to keep us going. Yeah. So I agree that, we shouldn't fall into nihilism necessarily if we do think that, this is a very atomistic process and, blah, 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 blah. And that's where I think, people who are striving to keep qualia alive, whether you could see qualia as a metaphor or you see that as having a metaphysical basis, it doesn't matter to me, because that's one thing that's unique about us. And when we do go into the future, and like you're saying, that we're going to have cyborgs, and certainly with artificial intelligence coming online, that sometimes you do, like you were saying with Ex Machina, have to pinch ourselves a little bit. I think that if we can look to our lineage and our past and appreciate all that is that's good about us, as again Plato would have us know, in aspiring to the logos and things like that. And Dave Snowden's a funny guy. He's a really bright systems complexity guy, and in some of his interviews and talks, he quotes Frozen 2, the children's movie, and I've not seen it, but there's a song that I guess the one sister doesn't have magic powers, and she's in this song. One of the refrains is, "I can only do the next right thing." And Dave Snowden, who's this like really intelligent guy, that's a go-to for him, and it's so impactful, like you know, and that's kind of like Bayesian calculus and sort of Carl Friston's work. And it's like you know, if I onboard certain new information, then what is my next move? And if you are again operating from a position of as you talk about with collectives of cells, this sort of altruism for the sake of not, performative altruism, but for what is this interdependence that we find ourselves in. And that's something else I would love to talk to you about. So I'll hush about that, but I'm agreeing with you 100%. Yeah, I think we can just have to learn to manage this horsepower that we have in terms of not just being instinctual creatures, that we've crossed over that threshold, and now we have these far more complex and dynamic means of navigating experience in each frame of the now moment and so forth and so on. So,
yeah, and that's the interesting thing, right? You mentioned qualia, and again, not to get deep into the consciousness issue, but the focus on qualia is, I think, automatically gives up a lot of ground because it's very passive. So qualia is the input side of the equation. It's how does it feel to be, and so you could imagine that something that is, and there are theories like this where you are just a passive experiencer that doesn't actually decide anything, you don't control anything. I mean, I find that to be it's an insidious and kind of pervasive way of thinking that I'm much more interested in that whole consciousness sort of field of study. I'm much more interested in the output side. So never mind what it feels like to have things happen to you. What is it like to have control? So what is it like to be an organism that exerts top-down control over your parts? What are the mechanisms that allow you to know which parts belong to you, right? And what are you, and what are the boundaries between you and the outside world? Not so that you can figure out how to receive impressions, although of course that's important too, but how you can act in the world. The active part of active inference is the key. This is what I love about active inference, is that it puts the emphasis on the fact that whatever it is that you are, you still have to decide what you're going to do next. And that's the key. It's the active part.
Yeah, I agree. And I think qualia has an importance, and maybe I could open up a can of worms here, because I love what is it, biosemiotics or something like that as a philosophical thought experiment. And so it can be down to the work you do, where there's chemoelectric processes going on receptor sites, and this is the communication, which is some of the work that you do, and that can be scaled up, even though we don't want to scale too much in this talk about it scaling too much in this conversation. But I think signaling and signifier and signified, if we could use that metaphor for this chemoelectric process between cells, and then it moves up between unions of cells, this broader communication, I think it goes all the way up into almost this aesthetics with like sexually reproductive creatures that display things and say, I'm healthy, look at my feathers, or look at whatever, and humans who, do things to attract other people. I see that immediately being a part and parcel of what we are, and it's not anything mysterious, not anything that I think is too weird. So maybe I'm going crazy here by talking about biosemiotics to aesthetics, but I almost think there's a link there in that. That again, like you said, it's more what you do with what you have. So the qualia can be there if you want to use that again as a thought model for, I smell a rose, or I see red, or and I feel there's a response in my relationality with the world at large, and all these kind of things. I think it's important, but we shouldn't get too hung up on it. And I think even people who staunchly defend qualia will then go on to say that maybe there is a kind of representationalism going on, and so then the qualia, is it really there, is it really lost, and versus some kind of naive realism where maybe there are quail out there, or so I'm not smart enough to get really into that fight or that argument, but for me it's just a useful thought model or heuristic, I guess, and that's it. And then I focus on other things, and in thinking about trying to think of where to go next. I want to throw a few kind of relatively quick questions to you, and then maybe we can get into ethics. And I wanted to see, was there anything else you wanted to talk about, like where we were just now with
No, keep going.
Okay. So I want to throw a couple things to you that we can fit into this conversation. Your work with understanding how to approach cancer from a different perspective and a different way of doing it, I think is fascinating. Again, people in the YouTube audience, watch some of Dr. Levin's talks on his channel, or just search him, and there's a lot of that being talked about. I also want to look at a couple other things like autoimmune. Is there anything that your work can show us and demonstrate when our bodies send antibodies to the wrong places and things go a little bit haywire? So I'll start with autoimmune, and I've got two other things that I want to throw at you.
Yeah, no, I don't have any specific things to say about immune system right now. We're studying it, but it's a very early stage, and I don't have anything to add beyond what some very smart immunologists have already said. So
okay. But down the road, do you think your work could contribute anything to that, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think so, but we're studying, sort of the bioelectrics of the immune system and all that. But the one thing I can say is that the immune system is often kind of called out as an alternative, another intelligence in the body besides the brain, right? So it has memory capacity, it has certain activities, and so that's all true. I think that's correct. But in my framework and that of my collaborators, the body is a huge patchwork of various kinds of observers. Cells and tissues that observe other cells and tissues are hacking each other constantly, meaning you're sending out simple signals that get the recipient to do complex things. The immune system is not unique. It's one of the ones we know best, and it's fantastic. It's an amazing thing. But there are many other subsystems in the body that are doing similar things in other spaces that are just harder for us to see. And I think it's just one of a huge number of agents that comprise what we call a whole body.
Okay. The other, I think I forgot my third question, but the other question I have for you in this vein is pathogenic bacteria and our sort of looming antibiotic crisis. Is there anything that you think the work that you're doing can give a fresh new lensing to that, a new focus to that, in terms of the body's means of dealing with pathogenic bacteria?
Yeah, we don't particularly work on that. I think there are a lot of really great people who are likely to make a big impact there. No, I don't have anything really important to add to that.
Okay, cool. And again, I think I forgot the third thing I was going to ask you, but it's probably kind of in that same vein because it never comes up in any of the other conversations. So I'm glad we could touch base on that. All right, so maybe we'll move into talking about the new frontiers of what the implications of the work you're doing and going forward. And so one of the first things that comes to mind for me, and I don't know if this is an ethical question, this is more of maybe a practicality question, and saying this, trying to remove as much of my emotional investment in the future of mankind as possible. When we look at the work that you're doing and your lab is doing, and some of the amazing things they're going to be onboarding probably in the next 20 to 25 or sooner, maybe 25 years. Let's say we do get to a place where we can do significant amounts of cancer mitigation. Limb regeneration is not so much of an issue here. Longevity, we can, beyond just lengthening our telomeres and things like that, that we can look at, like the planaria do, they just kind of go on and on forever. What are we going to have to do as a species to ensure that say if there's 8 billion of us right now, and we start lengthening our life by however many years, and more people survive cancer? This is really a draconian question, but I'm wondering, like, what do you see in the way of adjustments that this species would have to make in terms of populating the planet, affording people longer lives, and given, our kind of sloppy slapdash ad hoc model of dealing with the need for food, the need for energy, people wanting to live good, comfortable lifestyles, which I would certainly never begrudge anybody that. So I'll stop there and just, so I guess to rephrase the question, we're going to be seeing people living longer. We're going to see people not passing from certain diseases. And, do you see there a bumping in problem with our population as it is and the resource demands that we're putting on the planetary system, if our population should continue to grow? I mean, I'm naive about what this planet could, sustain in terms of our numbers.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that I'm in no way an expert on any of these, any of these social issues or what the planet can sustain. So I don't know. I'm going to give you some thoughts that I have from my end of things, but I certainly don't want to come off as some kind of expert on how many people can be supported and all that. Here's a couple of things. I do not believe that population control is a reason for letting people die of injury and disease.
Mm-hmm.
So because fundamentally the level at which we currently have aging and disease susceptibility is once again completely arbitrary. There's nothing magical or correct about where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
So you can easily imagine a planet where humans live 12 years on average and they get horrible diseases, and you look at that and you say, I think most people would say, well, that's not good. We should definitely at least get them up to what we consider standard human level.
Mm-hmm.
And then but now people say, okay, let's just leave us where we are. Don't do the anti-aging thing because 80 years is like, that's right. I mean, who picked 80 years? That's not, it could have been 10 years. It could have been 1,000 years. 80 is not, or it could have been, infinite. 80 years is not some magic proper number. So I have zero allegiance to the status quo. None.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's the first thing. There's nothing magic about our particular set of susceptibilities where, and people really, a lot of people really feel that way. They sort of say, you should just, kind of leave it how it is. Well, how it is terrible for a huge sector of the population, and B, it's completely arbitrary. There's no reason to prefer this particular level of disease susceptibility and aging.
Mm-hmm.
So, all of my, again, not an expert on this next part. So all of my thinking comes from many years of digesting science fiction and just sort of reasoning out what's possible. I mean, as far as I understand, the population is not rising anymore in the way that we thought it was going to be.
Okay.
My personal strong suspicion is that the energy crisis is going to be over. That is, we're going to discover what is in effect, and people have been talking about this, of course, for many decades, but I do think it's coming, which is free energy, which
Mm-hmm.
is some version of an energy technology where it is simply not expensive the way it is now. I think the future is going to be that. And so if that's the case, then you can really imagine many solutions to this problem. Maybe we don't have as many children. Maybe there's not as much turnover. Maybe we spread out into space. That seems to be very natural to me, is to not be confined to this, again, N of one, planet. I mean, it's lovely, but we need a backup. I'm not the first person to say that. So spreading out, I think once the energy issue is addressed, I think spreading outwards is perfectly reasonable. I just don't see those limitations as a reason to avoid really transformative regenerative therapies. There's no reason anybody should be dying from preventable disease or at a lifespan that was picked by this random meandering evolutionary surge.
Yeah, and I'm all for that too. And so my reason for posing the question was more on the other end, where it's going to take some maturity and responsibility, I think, species wide. I don't know how that's going to work, because we're certainly complex and we want to be sensitive to everybody's sensibilities. But yeah, that we can have people living to 120 or whatever within the next couple of generations, but that, maybe we understand how we scale up energy, how we scale up food availability, how we scale up quality of life, and, and maybe bearing children is part of that. Maybe, you know, responding to how many new persons are being onboarded to this planet. So yeah, I know that's a huge thing, and it has a lot of angles to it. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, though, because if you've ever thought about, if you think about these kind of things, when we look at life extension and yeah, absolutely, keeping people, you know, I've had cancer and I don't, it scares the shit out of me. So it's like, so you touched on something else that I had forgotten about. And so that's extraplanetary life for ourselves, or extra Earth life for ourselves. I would intuit from your work that we could set up, if you want to use the word engineered, human systems, human us, that can go to Mars and live there without facing some of the, what I would perceive to be some of the difficulties of living on Mars, with a variation in the gravity, without there being a magnetic field there. I believe it's a solid core now. It's not molten like us. And so I don't know if the electromagnetism of here is something that our bodies are, you know, if we're obligates of that type of structure, of that system, you know, with magma and the magnetic poles, all the other little things like the increased UV radiation. Do you think we could engineer ourselves to be able to make that a new habitat?
Yeah, again, not an expert in astrobiology or space medicine, so my comments are going to be very general.
Yeah.
I think that long before we get there, we will have already engineered ourselves in massively diverse ways here on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that future humans are going to look back to our current struggles with these binary categories, of you know, modification and you know, how people are just, you know, just slightly stepping out of the, you know, the configuration they were born into and all that. It's going to be laughable. People are going to have, you know, you know, tentacles and wings and you know, all kinds of smart implants and new sensors, and how many eyes do you want? And like, it's just going to be with that I think of it as a morphological freedom. You know, you are a freedom of embodiment is another way to put it. You are dumped here into this physical world with some configuration, maybe with things people call a birth defect, maybe not. But even if you're a perfectly healthy human, you have some level of capabilities and some level of limitations. And all of that is completely arbitrary, just totally arbitrary. So at some point, I consider it a moral imperative for us as a scientific community to provide for freedom of embodiment, so that at some point you can make a rational decision that you would like a different body, or you would like a different cognitive system, you would like to expand in some way. Maybe you want another brain hemisphere, maybe you want some sort of AI prosthetic. Who knows? All of it, to me, is up for grabs, and we are going to have such an amazing variety of beings that that further, you know, living, you're living underwater, you're living, who knows where you're living at that point, and extending that to be well adapted to extra planetary environments seems to me like a no-brainer. But then, of course, you know, I'm not an expert on the details, but I anticipate that that's going to be doable.
I think I don't know anything, but I think if we took, you know, what Mars has to offer in the way of an environment, be it gravity, be it electromagnetism, be it UV saturation, all these other things, that, yeah, we could code for that, or we could, you know, adjust for that. We could adjust for 350-year, you know, ion propulsion vehicles taking humans one generation, you know, for 350 years to another system that's habitable. And bringing ourselves there, and maybe then the progeny live on for 300. Yeah, they can live on 300-year lives and stuff. We would need something like that, I think, to go to other parts of the galaxy and do that. Now, there's the allegory of the polyploid horse that I think Gregory Bateson came up with. Are you familiar with that? It's a sort of it's a cautionary tale of a man who wanted a bigger, better horse. And so he did this, he generated a polyploidy horse, and this horse was twice as big and twice as this and twice as that. But then, you know, the obvious pitfalls of having a larger metabolic system that would overheat, and, you know, so certain things, there were trade-offs for this. Do you imagine, as you're forward thinking, that we're going to go through this again phase, or whatever this polyploidal horse allegory was meant to teach us? that will go through this kind of thing, or do you think we're going to be cautious and calculating enough to generate all these things you're talking about, generating ourselves as whatever morphs, X morphs that we want to be? Do you think there's going to be a trial and error phase, or do you think this is something that we can do really cleanly the first time through? Or do we scale up with other vertebrates and other mammals and things like that? And
yeah. Well, I mean, overall, I would never put money on humanity doing anything, sort of carefully and right the first time smoothly. That seems highly unlikely to me.
Okay.
But overall, yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot of important lessons working with model systems. I think the key is really, I mean, Bateson was pointing out an important thing, which is that we are currently, and we still are, very bad at estimating ahead the behaviors of complex multi-scale systems. So when we put together systems of competent agents, such as cells and tissues, we are, or robots in terms of swarm robotics or social systems or any of that, what is going to be the light cone, the cognitive light cone of that system? What goals will it have? What competencies will it have? What does it want to do? We are very bad at all of that, and so that certainly is going to plague these kinds of efforts to modify ourselves. I think, however, that part of the progress of science, and I am very long range optimistic about it, is that this is one of the things science will have to overcome. We are going to have a science of these things. And at that point, you can do better. You will always have surprises, and you will always have things you didn't think of, and things like that. But overall, I do think that there's a path forward for a rational way to do this. And in particular, one particular thing that I think is very going to be very critical to this is that we learn to deal with what I've called agential materials. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that we've been engineering with passive materials for thousands of years, right? So wood and metal and things like that. And the thing with passive matter is that you as an engineer, all you can count on is that it's going to keep its shape. That's pretty much it. There's some other stuff, but that's basically it. It doesn't do anything on its own. And then we've had active matter, and then we have computational matter and some things like that. But in biology, what you're dealing with is agential matter. So your material has an agenda, and that means that as an engineer, you're more of a behavior shaper. You're more of a trainer, or in some cases a psychiatrist than an old school engineer. So as a simple kind of example that I sometimes give my students, if you want to make a tower out of Legos, the original kind of initial strategies, it works well. So you just put the Legos exactly where you want. So all of that is on you, but it looks exactly like you want, and there's no surprises. But if it gets knocked down, that's it, right? You're gonna have to come back and put it back up. Now think about making a tower out of dogs. So you can't use the old version, the old way of doing it, because if you stack the dogs, they'll immediately run off. That doesn't work. But what you can do is train the dogs. So you're a different kind of engineer now, what hackers would call a social engineering, instead of the kind of the electronic version of hacking, but you're still hacking. What you're hacking is the competencies of your material. Whereas before you knew that the only thing you could really count on your material to do was stay where you put it. Now you're hacking your material by knowing that it's actually trainable. And so the good news there is, okay, well, you've had to use a different strategy, but now if that tower gg's knocked down again, it'll rebuild itself, right? The dogs will get right back up, and you don't have to be there to manage them to some extent. Mm-hmm. And so this goes all the way up. So all of that, that's a very kind of simplistic analogy, but what you're dealing with cells and tissues are subsystems that know how to achieve certain goals. They are not clockwork that can only be addressed by bottom-up rewiring, by reconstructing everything bottom up. And this is what molecular medicine, synthetic biology, this is what they're currently focused on. Okay, and it's all good stuff. All of that science does need to happen. But the thing that we're still leaving on the table largely, and this is what my lab has been trying to kind of climb up there, as some other labs too, is to engineer in this new fashion. We are doing more behavior shaping, because you're taking advantage of the native intelligence of the system. And I think that if we learn to take advantage of that, we're going to be way better off in in avoiding these unintended consequences. I'll give you just an extremely simple, and evolution does this already, by the way, and so I'll give you a very simple example. In the tadpole of the frog, if you were to make a mutation that pushes the mouth off to the side, so again, every mutations typically have multiple effects. So imagine you may have some mutation, it does something good in the body, but it also sort of pushes the mouth off to the side so the animal can't eat. If it were a clockwork, you would never get to explore, evolution would never get to explore the benefits of that, of the positive benefits of that mutation, because the fitness would be zero, the animals would die immediately. But what actually happens is if you create a tadpole, and we've done this, if you make a tadpole where the mouth is shifted off to the side, during the early phases of metamorphosis, it'll actually come back and get into the right position. And then that animal can explore the benefits of these other the other benefits of that mutation. So that robustness, that plasticity, the fact that these parts have competencies of their own, that you don't actually have to wait until you find a mutation that leaves the mouth be but does whatever this other nice thing is. You don't need to wait for that. The other stuff will already get taken care of, right? This gives engineering massive amount of acceleration over and evolution. It goes much faster because of the competencies of the material, because frog cells in a completely novel kind of configuration that is not natural whatsoever, they make a viable proto-organism. They make a xenobot. You don't need to evolve it. When you make a tadpole with a tail on its tail, we've done this, those animals can see. Even despite the optic nerve connects to perhaps the spinal cord in that case, not to the brain, and they can see in this complete. They don't need eons of evolutionary adaptation to this. So to the extent that we can learn to take advantage of those competencies, we're going to be much better off. But I don't think there's any way to say that there's never going to be surprises, or we're never going to be run afoul of some unintended consequence. That's always the case.
Right. And I guess that's the price you pay if the ends are to co-create with nature, in a sense, co-create with our own destiny. If that's not making sense, I'm trying to come up with a way to articulate this, that what we're doing is we're jumping outside of the normal stream, I think, of what life has been doing. And again, I understand and recognize what you said in the beginning of this conversation about getting trapped in binary thinking and linear thinking when we think about evolution and things like this. But I think this is, so I mentioned exaptive phenomena of psychology, and this strikes me as another exaptive process that and unless we're getting into teleological inferences here, that our ability to now co-create with what had been a fairly slow and sort of steady and almost seemingly linear process of evolution, that we can now have all these branch lines going out, strikes me as being very natural. It's weird and spooky, but it strikes me as being very natural that if we've reached this level of cognitive horsepower and sentience and all this kind of thing, that we can do these kind of things. I don't think we're straying from any kind of. So in other words, I guess people are, would push back on what we're saying here, that we're effing around with Mother Nature and we're playing God and all these kind of things. But I almost wonder, like, if we look at it from like the moon's perspective, some sort of outside view of what's going on, we're just creatures that are understanding the nature of, as you say, this kind of swarm intelligence and this kind of potential in morphospace. And yeah, maybe you can take over from here, but I'm just sort of not justifying what's going on here. And it's more that this seems like, is this just a natural next step? Maybe that's what I'm saying. Like this species has gotten to this juncture in time and space, and its understanding of its environment, its understanding of its composition. I'll let you take over from there. I mean, are we on some natural path when we do this? Because I think there would be people out there that would say, what are we doing? So
I get phone calls from those people. They tend to be fairly young, healthy people who have that opinion. I tell you, I think you're right, of course, in that we are a byproduct of nature, and so whatever we're doing is just sort of a secondary aspect of nature working out. But I don't even go there. I think this whole idea of being against Mother Nature, of being again of playing God, like these things, these are dangerous, primitive relics of an era where we didn't know enough to, and our only option was to assume that the status quo is in some sense the best, and let's not F it up, as you say.
Mhm.
This is a very dangerous way to go, because there isn't any evidence for that. And in fact, many people's lived experience, if this is if this is sort of nature's quote unquote intended version, screw that. I'm not up for it. And I get those phone calls. And I'm not even a clinician, but I get those phone calls on a daily basis, right? People whose kids have had birth defects, somebody's got a spinal cord injury, they're missing limbs, they're, the cancer, this and that. I mean, I don't, anybody, what I say when somebody says to me that, leave well enough alone and Mother Nature and whatever, I'm like, go to the pediatric oncology ward, spend a couple of days, and then you come back, and then you tell me that you think this is how things were supposed to be.
Right.
I think it's ridiculous. I think it's pernicious. I don't even go down that road. They're just like we it is a moral imperative to improve the lived experience of every sentient being. That's how I see it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I purposely brought up nature's chimeras earlier when we were talking about photosynthetic sea slugs and lichens and things like this, where there's this sort of crossover that just doesn't seem to follow any linearity when it comes to, and maybe it does, but it's a complex process. So yeah, I offer that as an example. We're coming up on our wall here of time, and one other thing I wanted to bring up, and if this was a good conversation with you, I'd love to have you back and we can talk about AI, or we can continue with ethics or whatever. Sure. One other ethical thing, or this is socio-political, as I noticed some of the people, your interlocutors of the past who have interviewed you, you talk about swarm intelligence, you talk about this sort of mutually beneficial altruism and cooperation in systems of cells, et cetera. And they lean into this kind of inference that, wouldn't that be grand if, in a social construct, we can have this collectivist thing. And you mentioned like, well, when you go hiking and you leave a patch of skin on a rock somewhere, talk to those skin cells. I agree with you, but I also want to reframe that thinking for just a second and say that I find it fascinating that, as per your work and what you point to in this, again, this cooperation of cells and this system of synergy, or whatever the hell you want to call it, that it reflects itself outwardly in the physical world. And we could start with ourselves. I mean, we were tribal creatures prior to the Younger Dryas or the last diaspora out of Africa. We traveled in large family units, and so there was this collective, this cooperative thing. And we could argue for selfish genes and all that crap, but I'm more thinking like this is cognitive, this is mental, and there's agreements. And then speaking of acceptive, we learn language, we learn to communicate. And then even when we settled into pastoral and sedentary agriculture, that there was still this sort of cooperative system. I almost see that as like a reflection of the internal states or the internal processes. Not that, again, I would go as far as to say, let's try collectivism and stuff like that, because I mean, we've seen some of the disasters that have happened in recent history for that. But I almost think, we can, like, so I'll take eusociality as an example in nature, like naked mole rats and things like that, and there are classes within them, and we see that show up in caste systems and even in 19th century European social structures and things like that. I mean, it just shows up everywhere, I think, and there's good and bad when it abstracts itself out of a physical system into more of a psychosocial system. But can we learn anything from this cooperative thing without, again, going into some weird Marxist kind of thinking or anything like that? Can we learn from stigmergic behavior? Can we learn from these abstractions away from physical systems to now, I guess, again, us being complex social creatures? Is there anything to be gained from that that beyond what you've critiqued, that we can see as examples?
I mean, look, I think on the one hand, I think it's very dangerous to extrapolate from different types of scenario, from cells to societies. I mean, it's natural to do that. I think that's dangerous. I don't necessarily think that the specifics of how they work is going to work out at other levels, but the
Mhm.
general thing is I think okay, which is can we develop a science of optimizing the connectivity between competent subunits to maximize the benefits that they reap from being part of a whole and minimize the costs.
Mhm.
So I see this as a very valid research project to look for those optimal policies for interaction. I don't know what they are. I don't have any background. I mean, I have some personal experience with collectivism, but I don't have any
Mm, mm.
any training in any of this political stuff. So I'm not gonna
Yeah.
opine on that. But I'm just gonna say that I think that we don't want to extrapolate exactly from the way that cells use gap junctions to hook up into tissues. But I do think that looking for optimal policies that maximize the rewards for being in groups and minimize the costs are
Mhm.
probably a very good thing to do.
Okay.
And again, in my sort of long-term future, if the cost of material things goes rapidly to zero, as if energy is really solved, then the cost of simple material things is going to plummet. And in that case, the reason to be in collective groups is because you get a kick out of it, not because it helps you survive a harsh world. And so that's what I'm looking for. I feel the same way about, what are we going to do when there aren't any jobs to do? You don't want to have a job that you have to do because otherwise you starve. That's not why we want to have jobs. So I feel like in the long term, the relationships that we have and the degree of collectivity that we are going to choose to have is going to be because it adds something to your life. It enriches your life in some way. It isn't because that's the only way you get to survive against, entropy and various attacks and things like that. So
Yeah.
that's how I look at it.
Yeah, and for better for worse, I think Young and a few others had pointed out in hunter-gatherer societies that the gathering and hunting took 3 to 4 hours of the day, and other time was spent introspection and again aesthetics or whatever it is that binds a community. So yeah, I agree with you, and I think even Noam Chomsky talks about this. Like, there's ways to differentiate the division of labor and things like that. And I try to stay way away from politics because for me, there's just nothing there other than chaos and craziness. But that we can figure out a way to do what needs to be done, like you said, when energy costs and scarcity and keeping up with the second law of thermodynamics for ourselves, et cetera, that maybe we can go and then enrich ourselves in other ways and find space and time for that. And gosh, we could live another 10 years because we don't kill ourselves stressing ourselves out. So
yeah. And I think this is something that everybody needs to sort of ask themselves as this kind of thought question, people who are interested in this kind of stuff. Imagine a planet where the humans have reached that kind of stable equilibrium where they live sort of in harmony with nature, hunter-gatherer tribes, everybody's sort of, the kind of thing that we talk about, they're only working for 3 to 4 hours. But let's say they do that, and that goes on for 500,000 years. They're the same at the end of the 500,000 years as they were on day one, right? Yeah. The individuals are having the same lives, they're not working themselves to death, over dumb things in an office somewhere, but that they're hunting and gathering exactly the same way. Right, so the question is, was that good in the sense of like, is that a good, is that worthwhile? Is that like, you look at that and you say, yeah, that's what we want. I personally, I don't like it, but some people may. And so that's the question, right? Is that we can look at these kind of societies and say, okay, well, that's how you do that. Is that what we want long term?
Yeah. And my invoking that idea of what we, so that's like anarcho-primitivism, and I'm not into that either. I like it as a critique to say, what can we learn from our past? But the idea of not working 70 hours a week or even 40 hours a week, and maybe it is 20 to 25, if everybody cooperates and there's, low demand and stuff like that, or low cost, that we can do what needs to be done, make sure everybody's taken care of, ourselves and everyone else. And then we have time to enrich ourselves, or however that looks. And I just think that's more beneficial to the organism as well as to the species as a whole. And I don't say that collectively. I look at us as a species, you know. And it's like what keeps me honest is we're a species, and if we want to continue as that species, that, you know, we can think about these things. None of it's prescriptive on my end. None of it's dictatorial. There's just thoughts I throw out there. So please. So Dr. Levin, this has been a great conversation. I hope it was okay for you. I know I threw some kind of weird screwballs to you and stuff like that, but I wanted to be different. I wanted to come at you with some different stuff. And if this worked out for you, then maybe we can have you back and we can dive into some other ideas and thoughts if this was a good experience. Okay, well, I thank you for your time very much and for your insights. Yeah. I'll say goodbye to you after we stop recording, and just real quick. And then to the YouTube audience, thank you guys so very much. We'll see you on the next one. Take care, everyone.